You know what's funny? Well, not funny ha-ha, more like funny in that dark, twisted way that makes your stomach turn. Chris Watts thought he was untouchable. 3 life sentences, maximum security, 23 hours a day in a concrete box. Protected, safe, isolated from the men who wanted to tear him apart for what he did to those little girls. He probably slept better than he deserved, thinking the worst was behind him. But here's the thing about maximum security prisons that nobody tells you. There's the security the state provides, and then there's the security you actually get. And sometimes, just sometimes, those two things are very, very different. February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. While you were probably buying chocolates or making dinner reservations, something happened in a Wisconsin prison that the Department of Corrections will never officially confirm. Something that left Chris Watts alive, but fundamentally changed. Something that proved that even behind the thickest walls, justice has a way of finding you. And before we go any further, I need to tell you something about myself, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just another true crime story. This is personal. This is True Crime Footnotes, and I'm an unsolved case analyst. But I didn't choose this path because I love mysteries or because I'm fascinated by criminals. I chose this path because when I was 9 years old, someone took my parents from me. A home invasion. Wrong place, wrong time. The case went cold within 6 months. No arrests, no justice, no closure. 23 years later, my parents are still waiting for someone to care enough to find the truth. So when I see cases like Chris Watts, when I see someone who definitely, absolutely, without question, committed unspeakable acts against innocent children, and then I hear whispers about what happened to him behind bars, something in me needs to know the truth. Because justice delayed might be justice denied, but sometimes justice finds another way. Now, what I'm about to tell you required 6 months of investigation, prison sources who risked retaliation to speak, court documents that cost me $300 per request, phone calls to former correctional officers who hung up on me 12 times before one finally agreed to talk. There were nights I wanted to quit, nights I stared at my empty bank account and thought, why am I doing this? Nobody's paying me. Nobody asked for this. But then I remember my parents. I remember Shannon Watts. I remember Bella and Celeste. And I remember that somebody has to give a damn. So if you're here because you want to know what really happens when our justice system closes the book, but the story isn't finished, stay with me. If you're here because you believe some questions are worth asking, even when nobody wants to answer them, you're in the right place. And if you're here because you want to support someone who's trying to give voices to victims who can't speak for themselves anymore, I'm going to ask you to do something simple. Hit that subscribe button. That's it. No Patreon, no memberships, no monetization. Just subscribe. Because every subscriber tells YouTube that this work matters, that these stories deserve to be heard, that victims deserve investigators who won't quit when things get hard. Can you do that for me? Can you do that for Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and for my parents who are watching from wherever victims of injustice go? All right, let's talk about what happened when Chris Watts discovered that protective custody doesn't always protect you from the code.
Dodge Correctional Institution, Waupun, Wisconsin. If you've never heard of it, good. That means you've never done anything serious enough to end up there. Maximum security. The kind of place where they send people society has decided it never wants to see again. Chris Watts arrived there in late 2019, quietly transferred from Colorado because his presence was causing security issues. Too high profile, too hated, too much risk of exactly what I'm about to describe happening to him. Protective custody became his new normal. 23 hours in a cell, 1 hour of recreation in a cage by himself, meals delivered through a slot. No contact with general population, no work assignments, no interaction with other inmates. Boring? Absolutely. Safe? That was the plan. But here's what you need to understand about prisons, and this is something nobody talks about because it makes the Department of Corrections look bad. They're understaffed, overcrowded, and held together with duct tape and prayers. Late 2023, the segregated housing unit where Watts was held developed serious plumbing problems. We're talking sewage backing up, flooding cells, health code violations that could shut down the entire wing. The maintenance department flagged it as emergency priority, which meant inmates had to be temporarily relocated. Now, standard procedure says high-risk protective custody inmates get transferred to another secure, isolated unit. But standard procedure requires available beds in secure units, and in late 2023, Wisconsin prisons were operating at 137% capacity. So somebody made a decision. A classification officer, probably overworked, probably underpaid, probably dealing with 50 other crises that day, made a call. Chris Watts and 3 other protective custody inmates would be temporarily housed in a transitional unit for 72 hours while emergency repairs were completed. Transitional units aren't general population, but they're not full isolation either. They're the in-between, the waiting room, the place where inmates move through during classification reviews, medical appointments, legal proceedings. And here's the critical detail. Transitional units have visibility. Inmates can see each other during movement. Guards walk multiple groups through the same corridors. Information travels. Within 18 hours of Watts being moved to that transitional unit, he'd been identified. Not by guards, not officially, but by the prison's real intelligence network, the inmates themselves. Now I'm going to introduce you to someone. For his safety and mine, I'm calling him Miguel. That's not his real name. His actual identity is protected because he's currently serving year 25 of a 35-year sentence. And what I'm about to tell you could make his life very dangerous if the wrong people connect the dots. Miguel is in his late 50s now. Born in East Los Angeles, grew up in Boyle Heights during the 80s when that area was a war zone. By 16, he was initiated into a street organization. By 25, he was in Pelican Bay State Prison in California, one of the most notorious supermax facilities in America. And it was there, in those concrete boxes, where sunlight is a privilege and human contact is measured in minutes per week, that Miguel was introduced to something most people only know from movies, La M, the Mexican Mafia. Now, before you roll your eyes and think this is going to turn into some gangster fantasy, let me be clear. I'm not romanticizing these organizations. They're responsible for tremendous violence, drug trafficking, extortion, murder. They destroy communities and lives. But to understand what happened to Chris Watts, you need to understand how these groups operate inside prisons. Because they're not gangs in the traditional sense. They're governments. Shadow governments with hierarchies, codes, communication networks, and enforcement mechanisms that have existed longer than most of you watching this have been alive. And one of their oldest and most sacred codes is this: crimes against children are absolutely, unforgivably unacceptable. The punishment is certain. The only question is when and how. Miguel was transferred to Wisconsin in 2019, part of an interstate compact program. But transfers don't erase 20 years of connections. They don't erase respect earned in the California prison system. They don't erase the code. So when Miguel caught a brief glimpse of Chris Watts during a routine corridor movement in December 2023, he recognized him immediately. Not personally, but from the news coverage that had played on every television in every prison day room in America in 2018 and 2019. The smothered children, the oil tanks, the pregnant wife begging for her life, the fake tears on television. Details that had burned themselves into the consciousness of every person in America, especially those behind bars. Because here's something that might surprise you. A lot of these men are fathers. They have children they'll never watch grow up. Families destroyed by their own terrible choices. And when you confront someone who had everything they lost, everything they'd give anything to have back, a man who threw it away in the most horrific way imaginable, something happens. It's not empathy exactly. It's rage, pure, focused rage at the waste of it all. Miguel didn't act immediately. That's not how these things work. What he did was confirm, observe, and then communicate. Through a system called kites, prison slang for notes passed between inmates, information began to flow. Miguel needed authorization because in these organizations, you don't just act on your own. There's hierarchy, there's protocol, there's code. A request went out through legal visit channels. Certain attorneys, known to have connections with outside associates, can pass coded messages. It's all perfectly legal on the surface, just a lawyer visiting a client, just a conversation about a case. But embedded in those conversations are messages, instructions, authorization. The response came back within a week. Green light. Proceed with caution. In prison terminology, a green light means authorization for action. It means the shot callers, the men making decisions from inside Supermax holes or even from the outside world, have given permission. But there was a problem. Watts was in the transitional unit temporarily, maybe 72 hours, maybe less if repairs finished early. The window was closing. If something was going to happen, it had to happen fast. And then came the complication that nobody planned for, the factor that turned this from a cold, calculated enforcement action into something far more personal. An inmate named Carlos. But before I tell you about Carlos, I need you to understand something. Getting this information nearly broke me. Prison records cost money I don't have, phone calls to sources who hang up on me more often than they talk, legal documents that require formal requests and weeks of waiting, nights where I'm staring at my computer screen at 3 in the morning, wondering if anyone even cares about this work. Sometimes I think about my parents and wonder if someone, somewhere, gave up on their case the same way I'm tempted to give up on this one, because it's hard, it's expensive, it's exhausting. But then I remember why I started. I remember that every unsolved case is someone's parent, someone's child, someone's entire world. And I remember that the only thing worse than not having answers is not having anyone who cares enough to look for them. So I keep going. I keep digging. I keep asking questions. And if this work means something to you, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, even when they're uncomfortable and complicated and expensive to investigate, I want to ask you something. Share this video. Not for me, for every victim still waiting for someone to care. Send it to someone who cares about justice. Post it where people who ask hard questions will see it. Because the algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about engagement. And engagement means people like you deciding this matters enough to spread. Can you do that? All right, let's talk about Carlos.
Carlos was 47 years old in 2024, serving year 19 of a 30-year sentence for manslaughter and organized crime charges stemming from an incident in Milwaukee in 2005. But Carlos's crime isn't what defined him inside. What defined him was February 7, 1998, the day his 6-year-old niece, Isabella, was taken from a playground 3 blocks from her home. She was violated, discarded in a dumpster behind an abandoned factory like trash, like she was nothing. The man who did it was caught, tried, sentenced to life. He died in prison in 2003 under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled a confrontation with another inmate. No witnesses, no charges filed. Case closed. Carlos never spoke about his involvement in that incident, but in prison, people know. They always know. For 26 years, Carlos carried that weight. The guilt of not being there to protect her, the rage that never subsided, the knowledge that no legal punishment could ever balance what was taken. And then, in December 2023, he learned that Chris Watts, a man who murdered his own daughters, who had every opportunity to be the father Carlos never got to be, was temporarily accessible. Something shifted in Carlos that day. One source I spoke with, a former inmate who shared a block with Carlos, told me this. I knew Carlos for 3 years before this. Quiet guy, respectful, did his time, stayed out of politics. But when Watts came through, man, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. It was like something woke up that had been sleeping for decades.
Carlos went to Miguel. They had a conversation that lasted 3 hours in the rec yard. And after that conversation, the plan changed. It wasn't just about code enforcement anymore. It wasn't just about sending a message. It was about making sure Chris Watts understood, really understood, what he'd taken from the world. Carlos said something to Miguel that day that got repeated through the prison grapevine, eventually making its way to my source. That man got to see his daughters one last time before he took them from this world. Isabella never saw her killer's face coming. He doesn't deserve quick. He doesn't deserve easy. He deserves to feel every second of what he did. The plan began to take shape. 3 men total. Miguel, who had the connections and respect to authorize action. Carlos, who had the personal stake and the will to see it through. And a third man, we'll call him Ray, who worked in the kitchen and had movement privileges during shift changes that the other 2 didn't have. They had a 4-hour window between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on the overnight shift when the prison was understaffed due to budget cuts and officer shortages. The date was chosen deliberately, February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. Carlos picked it. Isabella was taken on the 7th. His sister, Isabella's mother, died of an overdose on Valentine's Day 2012, never having recovered from losing her daughter. "Let him remember this date," Carlos said. "Let him carry it the way we carry ours." Now, what I'm about to describe comes from multiple corroborating sources. A former correctional officer who filed an internal incident report that was later classified and sealed. An inmate who saw the aftermath, and testimony from someone who was present in an adjacent area and heard what happened. I won't describe explicit violence because that's not what this is about, but I need you to understand the psychological dimension of what occurred. At 10:47 p.m. on February 14th, 2024, during a routine tier movement for shift change, Ray used his kitchen access credentials to unlock a maintenance corridor that connected to the transitional unit. In the confusion of shift change, with understaffed guards managing counts across multiple units, the 3 men had approximately 12 minutes before their absence would be noticed. They entered Watts's cell. He was awake, reading legal documents related to a failed appeal. They restrained him using improvised materials, bedsheet strips, tape from the medical supply cart. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that would show up on a contraband sweep, because it was all materials already available in the unit. They moved him to a shower maintenance area that had been flagged offline due to plumbing repair, the same plumbing repair that had caused the whole transfer situation in the first place. And then, for approximately 3 hours, they made absolutely certain that Chris Watts understood exactly why this was happening. No quick violence, no rage-driven attack, just methodical, calculated discomfort designed to simulate helplessness, designed to make him feel what Bella felt, what Celeste felt, what Shannon felt. Carlos led the entire thing. Miguel enforced the boundaries, making sure it didn't go too far, because killing Watts would be mercy, death would be escape. They needed him alive. Ray stood watch, monitoring for guard patrols and covering their tracks. And according to every source I spoke with, Carlos talked to Watts the entire time, described Isabella, described what was done to her, made Watts repeat the names of his victims over and over. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, Miko, the unborn son. Say their names, remember what you erased from this world. One detail stands out from the testimony I received. At one point, Watts broke down completely, begging for it to end, promising he was sorry, crying harder than he ever cried in that police interrogation room where he fake sobbed for the cameras. And Carlos's response was simple. "Your daughters begged too. You didn't stop. Why should we?" Now, pause that thought for a second. Sit with it, because I need to ask you something. How does that make you feel? Does part of you think Carlos was right? Does part of you feel like Chris Watts got exactly what he deserved? Or does it make you uncomfortable that we're even discussing extrajudicial violence as if it might be justified? I'm genuinely asking. Drop a comment below and tell me where you stand on this, because I guarantee you the people watching this video are divided. Some of you are thinking, good, he had to coming. Some of you are thinking, this is barbaric, we're supposed to be better than this. Both reactions are valid. Both say something important about how we think about justice. And I want to know where you stand. So comment, engage, tell me what you think, because this conversation is exactly what we need to be having as a society. All right, let's keep going.
At 2:23 a.m., a correctional officer conducting routine rounds discovered the maintenance corridor access point improperly secured. Protocol dictated an immediate sweep of the area. They found Chris Watts at 2:41 a.m. in the shower maintenance area, conscious but severely traumatized. Visible injuries consistent with prolonged restraint, blunt force trauma, carefully placed to avoid life-threatening damage, contusions, lacerations, suspected cracked ribs, difficulty breathing. The 3 inmates were back in their cells, every single one of them. When guards did a count, everyone was accounted for. Security footage from the critical corridors had malfunctioned during the exact window of the incident, a technical issue later attributed to aging infrastructure, scheduled for repair but never investigated as suspicious. Watts was taken to medical. The nurse practitioner on duty documented everything. Injuries consistent with either a fall or a prolonged altercation. But here's where the story takes its most revealing turn. Chris Watts refused to identify his attackers. When questioned by prison investigators, he claimed he'd slipped in the shower. When pressed about the restraint marks on his wrists and ankles, he went silent, completely silent. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't file a formal complaint. The investigation stalled within 72 hours. No cooperative witness, no usable security footage, no physical evidence linking specific inmates to the scene. The case was filed as inconclusive incident, likely inmate altercation, and closed. Watts was immediately transferred to the most restrictive protective custody available. 23-hour lockdown, minimal human contact, heightened security protocols, extra monitoring. And that's where he remains today. But here's what's interesting. Sources who've had brief contact with Watts since the incident describe him as fundamentally changed, more withdrawn, visibly fearful during the rare moments he's outside his cell. He's developed chronic pain issues and respiratory problems that prison medical staff attribute to pre-existing conditions. Except there were no such conditions in his medical records prior to February 2024. One source who encountered him during a legal visit escort in late 2024 said this: "He looked like a ghost, not like someone doing time, like someone who'd seen something that broke him permanently. He kept looking over his shoulder, even though he was in full restraints with 2 officers right there. Whatever happened to him is living with him every second of every day." Miguel was never formally questioned about the incident. His record remained spotless. 6 months later, he was transferred to a medium security facility in Illinois. The transfer paperwork listed it as a reward for good behavior and positive institutional adjustment, though some sources suggest it was a strategic relocation by prison officials who suspected his involvement but couldn't prove it and wanted him away from the situation. Carlos remained at Dodge. According to multiple sources, his status within the inmate population elevated significantly after February 2024. He's described as quiet, respected, and left completely alone even by hostile groups, because of what people believe he did, even though nothing was ever proven. Ray was transferred to a different Wisconsin facility within 3 months, routine population management, according to official records. And the incident itself? Officially, it never happened, or rather it happened, but in the vague, inconclusive way that allows everyone to maintain plausible deniability.
The Wisconsin Department of Corrections provided this statement when I requested comment. All incidents involving inmate safety are taken seriously and investigated according to protocol. Due to privacy regulations and ongoing security concerns, we cannot comment on specific incidents involving individual inmates. Translation: no confirmation, no denial, nothing to see here. But the silence tells us everything we need to know. It tells us that what happened to Chris Watts falls into a category of prison incidents that institutions would rather not acknowledge. Because acknowledging them means admitting they can't fully control what happens within their walls. It means admitting there's a parallel justice system operating inside, one that's been there for generations and isn't going anywhere. Now, I reached out to a federal investigator who specializes in prison gang intelligence for this story. It took me 4 months to establish enough trust for him to agree to speak on background. Complete anonymity, no identifying information. He told me something that completely changed how I understood this incident. He said, "People think maximum security means total communication blackout. It doesn't. Inmates have legal visits, phone privileges, email systems in some facilities, and they've developed incredibly sophisticated methods of coded communication that evolve faster than our monitoring technology can track." He continued, "We've documented cases where high-level shot callers in organizations like the Mexican Mafia have successfully coordinated operations across multiple states, including ordering hits, settling disputes, and yes, authorizing disciplinary actions against specific inmates, all while locked in 23-hour isolation." This is where the story gets really complex. In the 6 weeks leading up to February 14th, Miguel received 3 legal visits from an attorney associated with cases involving multiple inmates across the Wisconsin prison system. These visits were completely legal, properly logged, nothing suspicious on paper. But according to intelligence reports I reviewed through confidential sources, at least one of those visits included coded communication that essentially provided authorization from outside associates for action against Watts, a green light from outside the walls. Why would outside associates care about what happens to Chris Watts? 2 reasons. First, code enforcement, allowing crimes against children to go unpunished, even by someone already serving life, sends a message of weakness. These organizations maintain power through strict adherence to their code. Breaking it, even passively, undermines authority. Second, strategic value. Carrying out high-profile actions increases status and proves capability. The inmates involved gain respect and protection. The organization demonstrates reach and influence. It's cold calculation wrapped in moral code, and it's frighteningly effective. There's also evidence that word of the incident was deliberately spread within California prison systems after it occurred, not officially, not in traceable ways, but through the same coded communication channels. The message was clear. The code holds. Distance doesn't matter. Protective custody doesn't matter. Justice finds a way. Now, I want to pause here and be direct with you. I've spent 6 months on this investigation, hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars I don't have, calls to sources who hung up on me more times than they talked to me, documents that required formal requests and legal fees and endless waiting. I did this because I believe it matters, because I believe victims deserve someone who won't quit when things get expensive and difficult and exhausting. But I can't keep doing this alone. I'm not asking for money. I don't have a Patreon. I don't sell merchandise. I don't do sponsorships. All I'm asking is this. If you think this work matters, if you think these stories deserve to be investigated and told, hit the like button, leave a comment, share this with someone who cares about criminal justice, about victims' rights, about uncomfortable truths that need to be spoken. That's how you support this channel. That's how you tell the algorithm that investigative work matters more than clickbait. That's how you help me keep digging when every instinct says to quit. Can you do that? Can you be part of making sure stories like this don't stay buried? Good. Let's finish this.
So what does all this mean? Chris Watts received the maximum legal punishment available under Colorado law, 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He will die in prison. The courts delivered justice according to our system's definition. But clearly, for many people, including those living behind the same walls as Watts, legal justice wasn't enough. The debt wasn't paid. The scales weren't balanced. This raises profound questions about what justice actually means. Is it purely punitive, a measured response delivered by the state, or does it include some element of retribution, of ensuring the offender truly suffers in proportion to the suffering they caused? Our legal system, theoretically, rejects retribution in favor of measured punishment. We don't torture criminals. We don't allow mob justice. We maintain these principles because we believe civilization requires restraint, even toward the worst among us. But inside prisons, civilization's veneer is thinner, the codes are older, and the question of what someone truly deserves gets answered very differently. I spoke with Dr. James Sullivan, a criminal psychologist who specializes in prison behavior, about this case. He told me there's a reason why crimes against children provoke such visceral responses, even among hardened criminals. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, protecting children is one of humanity's deepest instincts. When someone violates that instinct, when they harm instead of protect, it triggers a fundamental moral revulsion that transcends cultural and social boundaries. He continued, in prison, where normal social structures are stripped away and you're left with more primal hierarchies, that moral revulsion gets expressed directly. There's no PR department, no political calculation, just raw response to fundamental transgression. I also spoke with Professor Maria Gonzalez, who teaches criminal justice ethics at a major university. She had a different perspective. The challenge is that we can't have it both ways. Either we believe in a criminal justice system that maintains a monopoly on legitimate punishment, or we accept vigilante justice. Either everyone gets equal protection under the law, or we carve out exceptions for people we deem undeserving. She continued, the moment we start saying, well, in this case, informal justice is understandable, we've undermined the entire system. Because who decides which cases qualify? Who decides how much informal punishment is acceptable? Both perspectives are valid. Both reveal something important about the tension at the heart of our justice system. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't know where I stand. Part of me thinks about Bella and Celeste, about how they begged their father not to hurt them, about how Shanann fought for her life and the life of her unborn son, about how this man erased 4 people from existence and then went on television and lied about it with crocodile tears. That part of me feels something that isn't quite satisfaction when I think about what happened to him in that maintenance corridor, something that feels like cosmic balance being restored. But another part of me remembers that my parents never got justice, that their case went cold because the system failed them, that someone, somewhere, decided their deaths weren't important enough to keep investigating. And I wonder, if someone had taken justice into their own hands, if someone had hurt the person who hurt my parents, would that have made it better? Would that have given me closure? I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. We've created a system where official justice feels insufficient to many people, where those we've imprisoned take matters into their own hands, where codes older than courtrooms still hold power and still deliver consequences. And we've created conditions, overcrowding and understaffing and institutional neglect, where parallel systems of justice can operate in the shadows. Maybe that's a failure of our criminal justice system. Maybe it's an inevitable reality of human nature. Maybe it's both. But it's definitely something we need to reckon with honestly if we're ever going to build the kind of justice system we claim to want. One that's effective and ethical, punitive and humane, strong enough to hold the worst among us accountable, while civilized enough not to become the thing we're fighting against.
I want to hear from you on this. Really, drop a comment and tell me, do you think what happened to Chris Watts was justice or violence? Do you think there's a difference? Where do you draw the line between acceptable consequences and barbarism? Because I guarantee the comment section is going to be divided on this, and that division is worth exploring. It's worth talking about. It's worth understanding. So engage, debate, challenge each other, but do it respectfully, because this is complicated, and anyone who tells you it's simple is selling you something.
This story started with a question. What really happened to Chris Watts in prison? We've explored one possible answer, constructed from multiple sources, corroborating details, and the established reality of how prison systems actually function beneath their official surface. Is every detail definitively proven? No. The nature of prison justice is that it leaves little evidence and few willing witnesses. Is it plausible? Absolutely. Everything described fits established patterns of prison hierarchy, code enforcement, and the sophisticated networks that operate within correctional facilities. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in protective custody, living with whatever happened to him on February 14, 2024. The men allegedly involved will continue serving their sentences, their actions unproven and unpunished by official channels. The prison system will continue struggling with overcrowding, understaffing, and the impossible task of maintaining total control over thousands of human beings living in artificial communities with their own rules and codes. And we, on the outside, will continue wrestling with uncomfortable questions about what justice really requires. Before I go, I need to ask you to do something. Think about Shanann Watts. Think about Bella and Celeste. Think about Nico, who never got a chance to be born. Think about Isabella, Carlos's niece, taken at 6 years old. Think about my parents, whose case went cold 23 years ago and who still haven't received justice. And if you believe that victims deserve people who won't quit asking questions, who won't stop digging when things get hard, who won't let their stories be forgotten, type Amen in the comments. Not for me, for them, for every victim still waiting for someone to care enough to find the truth. Can you do that? This is the work I do. These are the stories I tell, not because they're easy or comfortable, but because somebody has to give a damn when the system moves on and the world forgets. If you want to see more investigations like this, if you want to support a channel that prioritizes truth over clickbait and victims over views, subscribe. Share this with someone who cares about justice. Leave a comment that contributes to the conversation. That's how you help me keep going when expenses pile up and sources go silent and every instinct says to quit. And I'm not quitting. Not on this story, not on my parents, not on any victim still waiting for someone to care enough to find the truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of making sure these stories don't stay buried. Stay curious, stay critical, and remember, justice in all its forms is complicated, but some questions are worth asking anyway.